The horror movie genre as we know it today is almost entirely inspired by one disturbed man.
Henry's a nice man, just like anybody else. The only difference I'd say in the man, he seems to be a little hot.
They went in investigating with flashlights. It was pitch black because there was no electricity and no lights. And one of the lawmen felt something bump against his shoulder. He turned, shined his flashlight on it, and indeed, there was Bernice Warden hanging from the rafters.
Now, trust me, I love horror movies as much as the next person. I saw my first scary movie when I was 4. It was 13 Ghosts. My sister took me to see House of Wax in the movie theater when I was only 7. I grew up on scary movies. And to this day, they're still probably my favorite genre of movie, and I still get scared. But even as a child, I could still sleep well at night knowing that it's all pretend. But the man I'm going to tell you about today is all too real. A man so terrifying that he pretty much single-handedly inspired the entire horror movie genre. I'm warning you now that this episode is not for the faint of heart. It's not for those of you that have a weak stomach. What I'm going to tell you will deeply disturb you. During the 1950s, in a small rural town that was surrounded on almost all sides by farmland, one of the most horrific discoveries in American history was made. During this time in Plainfield, Wisconsin, the town was made up of less than 700 people, and amongst this small community was one lonely, strange man. Ed Gein was known around his town of Plainfield as being a little slow, a little shy, and a little strange. But he was also known around town as being kind, honest, and hardworking. He actually did a bunch of odd jobs around town for his neighbors, which included babysitting their young children. But by 1957, Ed Gein would only be known as the Butcher of Plainfield, after the discovery that the shy, lonely babysitter was killing, mutilating, and turning people into furniture. Welcome back to this week's investigation. Please make sure that you're following, subscribe, like, rate, and review the show because it really does help. My name is Brianna, and I'm hot on the case. Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27th, 1906, and had a very restrictive, fear-ridden, isolated, and traumatic childhood that left him disturbed and emotionally stunted. Ed's father was an abusive alcoholic. He was a weak man who couldn't hold down a job, and he took his frustrations out physically on his wife and 2 children. Ed had an older brother. His name was Henry, and Ed's older brother Henry will be a very important part of today's story. But probably the biggest influence on young Ed Gein was his mother, Augusta. Augusta was a hard-working woman. She ran a small but successful grocery store in La Crosse County during the early years of Ed's childhood. In a time where women were expected to be homemakers, raise children, Augusta was out working in town providing for her family because her husband would not. Unfortunately, Augusta was also quite abusive to her children in more ways than one. Augusta had some very extreme beliefs and was fanatically religious. She truly believed that the world, society as a whole, was evil and full of sin. She saw the county that they lived in, La Crosse, as this place that was like truly evil, and she was terrified that this town and the world, society, would corrupt her 2 young sons, Ed and Henry, which led to the decision that the entire family would move to a farm on the outskirts of Plainfield, Wisconsin when Ed was 8 years old. The Gein farm sat on about 155 acres of land, and it was about a mile away from any other neighbor. But this is exactly what Augusta wanted. She wanted to isolate her children, Ed and Henry, on this isolated farm in this rural small town, far and far away from sin and evil. Augusta's parenting style was to scare her kids straight. If they didn't stick to the straight and narrow, then they would burn for eternity in hell. Augusta saw the world as disgraceful, immoral, disgusting, and evil. But the worst of the worst were women and sex. According to Augusta, she would tell her children that all women were prostitutes, and she made her 2 sons promise that they would stay virgins for the rest of their lives, and they would just forever stay at home with mom and never leave her. Augusta made sure that her children knew that she was not evil, but all other women were. She was not disgusting and disgraceful, but other women were. All sex was immoral and unforgivable, except when Augusta did it to bring her children into the world. The teachings did not land so much for Ed's older brother, Henry. Henry would try and stand up to his mother, but the brainwashing really took for Ed. Their mother, Augusta, I think really did want to protect her children. Just the ways that she did it weren't right, but at the same time, she was also extremely abusive to them. Physically, but also verbally. She mocked and humiliated her 2 sons. But the entire time, Ed idolized her. He was a mama's boy to the extreme. He was obsessed with his mom, and he really did believe every single word that she told him, and he saw his mother just as this being that could do no wrong. She was truly like a saint to him. Life on the Gein farm was a lot of things. Augusta no longer had her store. Her husband couldn't hold down a job. He did tan hides, turn animal skin into leather, which was a skill that Ed would unfortunately take up when he got older. But overall, life on the Gein farm was lonely. The children weren't allowed to have any friends. They went to school, but they didn't have any other interaction with children their own age outside of school. And in school, Ed was a target for bullying because he looked and sounded different. He had a bit of a speech impediment. He had a little bit of a lazy eye. People described him as slow and socially awkward, and he would come home from school most days crying, but then his emotionally unavailable parents would never comfort him. About 2 years after the Gein family moved to the farm, when Ed was 10 years old, there were the first signs that Ed Gein had a disturbed mind. His parents, who were just, working on the farm, slaughtered a pig right in front of 10-year-old Ed. And instead of traumatizing the 10-year-old boy, Ed said that this aroused him. And he actually claims that he finished himself to the sight of this pig being slaughtered. So it's very clear that from a very young age, something wasn't quite right up here with Ed. He obviously had a skewed view of the world and women and relationships, but this was something completely different. In the 1940s, while Ed Gein was in his 30s, his entire family would die. First, it was his father who passed away from heart failure. Ed and his older brother Henry were obviously still living on the farm with mom because Augusta never wanted them to leave. Together, the brothers began working odd jobs around town to help bring in money to support and provide for their mother, who is now a widow. But it was while Henry and Ed were out in the town doing these odd jobs away from their mother that Henry began trying to talk some sense into his younger brother Ed. Ed was definitely intellectually delayed. At the time, they called this slow, but this is an outdated term. He was also clearly struggling with his mental health. But unfortunately, due to the time that this case took place, his mental health struggles were not something that he would have gotten help for before it was too late. But I'm sure that his older brother Henry knew that there was something wrong, that his brother was struggling in these different ways. And Henry really did try to help his little brother. He would criticize his mom to Ed whenever they were out doing these odd jobs away from Augusta. He criticized her extreme beliefs, the way that she treated them, but especially the relationship that Ed had with his mother. Henry saw this relationship for what it was, that it was unhealthy and inappropriate. Henry told Ed that it was not normal to be obsessed with your mom the way that Ed was obsessed with their mother. Henry also told Ed that Ed should commit the biggest sin there is according to their mother. Henry told Ed that he should go out and meet a nice woman and move out of their mother's home. Henry actually confided in his little brother that that was something that he was actually planning to do soon. Henry was going to move out of their mother's home. He was going to leave the family farm, and he was going to do this to go be with a woman. She was actually a divorced mother of 2. And this was quite literally the most immoral, disgusting thing that Henry could do, according to their mother, Augusta. Not only was her oldest son planning on leaving her to go be with a woman, and we all know what Augusta thinks about that, but this is a woman who's already had children. And remember, the deed to conceive children is absolutely evil and disgusting. But this was a woman who was also already married and divorced as well, and that is something that is definitely frowned upon in the Bible. Henry Gein would never move in with this lady that he planned on spending his life with, because it wouldn't be long later after he told his brother his plans to move on that Henry Gein would die under very suspicious circumstances. It was 1944. The Gein brothers, Ed and Henry, were doing some yard work. They started a small fire to burn up some brush and some plants and stuff like that, when according to Ed, the fire got out of control. So Ed went and he went to go call the fire department. They came and they put out the fire, but it was after the fire was put out that Ed realized that his older brother Henry, who was there when the fire started, was now missing. So Ed made a second call, this time to report his brother missing. But when the investigators got there, Ed suspiciously and immediately led them straight to his brother's dead body. Henry was laying face down in some marsh area not far from where the fire had started. Without an autopsy being done, his death was ruled an accident. It was determined that he had inhaled too much smoke from the fire and died from smoke inhalation. Even though there was zero evidence that Henry Gein was burned or inhaled any smoke at all, like there wasn't ash coming out of his nose like you usually see when someone passes away from smoke inhalation. But there were fresh bruises and injuries to the back of Henry's head. It couldn't be proven at the time, but it's widely believed that Ed Gein killed his brother, that this was Ed Gein's first ever victim. After this, it was just Ed and his mother, and Ed doted after his mother, Augusta. Shortly after the death of her firstborn, Augusta actually suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed. Ed became his mother's full-time caregiver, worshiping her completely until she passed away the following year in 1945, leaving Ed Gein devastated and completely alone on his family farm. Ed Gein became even more isolated than he already was. He became a near total recluse. He stopped bathing, really stopped any kind of hygiene, and he smelled really, really bad. His house was also just disgusting. There was filth everywhere, except for Ed's mother's Augusta's bedroom that Ed kept preserved exactly how she left it. He sealed off her bedroom, kept it like a shrine to his mother that he struggled to accept was really dead. And this was really the beginning of Ed's spiral into insanity. He lost a total grip of reality. He spent countless hours locking himself away in his family home, reading books on the human anatomy and some other disturbing topics like cannibalism and Nazi medical experiments. Ed continued to do odd jobs around his small town, just making enough that he was able to survive. And although Ed smelled really bad and was kind of weird, he was still generally liked. He was known around Plainfield as being strange and shy and lonely, a bit mentally challenged, but overall harmless. One of the odd jobs that Ed did for his neighbors was actually babysitting their young children. Everything seemed fine in their small little town of Plainfield and the neighboring towns around them, until people began to go missing, vanishing into thin air, never to be seen alive again. It began in 1947 when an 8-year-old girl named Georgia Jean Weckler vanished on her way home from school. And then in 1950, when 2 men, Victor Travis and Ray Burgess, vanished on a hunting trip in Plainfield. And then in 1953, when a 15-year-old girl named Evelyn Hartley vanished while babysitting. The house that she was babysitting at was broken into. There were clear signs of a struggle inside the house. Blood was found inside and outside, but 15-year-old Evelyn was just gone. Luckily, the baby that she was tasked of taking care of was left unharmed. And then a year later, in 1954, Mary Hogan, who owned a tavern in town near Ed's farm, vanished as well. Blood was also found on the floor of the tavern, as well as a bullet casing, which confirmed that Mary Hogan likely met foul play. They just couldn't find her body. 3 years later, another local shop owner also disappeared from her business. It was November 16, 1957. A 58-year-old widow, Bernice Warden, disappeared. The cash register was also missing, and there was a trail of blood leading out of the store right out the back door. Bernice's son just so happened to be a deputy sheriff, and he knew that something was terribly wrong, and he immediately began investigating his mother's disappearance, and this led him straight to Ed Gein. His mother never left her hardware store. So he went and he checked the last receipt, which was for antifreeze that was purchased by Ed Gein. Ed Gein was brought into custody. They found him at a local grocery store, and then a group of officers, which included Bernice's son, went to the Gein farm to do a search. And what they found was worse than your worst nightmares. Bernice's own son found her dead body in a shed on the Gein farm. Bernice was decapitated, mutilated, disemboweled. Her body was hanging upside down from the rafters by her ankles. Reports say that she was gutted like a deer. Pieces of Bernice could be found everywhere.
They went in investigating with flashlights. It was pitch black because there was no electricity and no lights. And one of the lawmen felt something bump against his shoulder. He turned, shined his flashlight on it, and indeed, there was Bernice Warden hanging from the rafters.
Her organs were removed. They were found in a bucket. Her head was in a sack. In a plastic bag, they found Bernice's heart. It was actually found in a plastic bag in Ed's kitchen right by his stove. So, don't want to even imagine what he was planning to do with that. But this was just the beginning of the horrific discoveries at the Gein farm. Ed Gein, for the last 5 or so years, had been taking human remains and turning them into furniture, clothing, and accessories. This is some of what was found at Ed Gein's home. In the home, investigators from the small town's sheriff's office found chairs crafted out of human leg bones. There was also chairs that were upholstered with human skin, a lampshade that was made from multiple human faces, utensils made from bones. Human skulls were found everywhere. Some were used as a decoration. Some Ed turned into bowls to eat out of. Ed had taken these people's bodies, and these were real people with hopes and dreams and families. And he didn't just turn them into furniture, he turned them into clothing that he actually wore. Gloves were found that were made from human skin. A vest that had women's breasts on the front, leggings made from human skin, a belt that was completely made out of women's nipples, and multiple masks that Ed had made from taking women's faces. There were also just body parts scattered throughout the entire property, lips, fingers, noses. There was also a box that was just filled of women's genitalia. Ed Gein's goal, which he pretty much succeeded in, was to make a suit completely made out of women's skin. He had the vests with the breasts, the leggings, the masks, the gloves. He even placed one of these women's body parts over top of his male body part, and he would wear this women's suit. And I think he did this because he wanted to become his mother. I don't think he could accept that she was really gone. And Ed said that he would actually put this like women's skin suit on, and he would go out during the full moon and go outside and dance around in this skin suit. Could you even imagine seeing that? Like, just envision that for a second. It's absolutely terrifying. On the Gein property, investigators also found the remains of the missing tavern owner, Mary Hogan. One of the masks that Ed Gein had made was actually the mask of Mary Hogan's face. So this is obviously one of the most horrific crime scenes I've ever heard about. And for these small town officers, they believed that in this moment, they had just discovered one of the most prolific serial killers the world had ever seen and would ever see. But not quite. Technically, and I actually don't think a lot of people know this, Ed Gein is technically not even a serial killer. When Ed Gein was first arrested, he refused to speak. And then when he did speak, he denied everything. He did eventually make a full confession. He confessed to killing Mary Hogan and Bernice Worden, but he said that those were the only two people he ever killed. And I'm sure you're questioning how that's possible when I just told you of at least 2 or 3 dozen bodies that were just found on his farm. Well, Ed claims that he was a grave robber, a body snatcher. It actually started with his mother, Augusta. He just could not accept that she was really dead. So about a year and a half after Augusta died, he went and he dug up her body. He brought it home, and then he actually claims that he shrunk her head so he could keep it forever. And I don't really know what happened after that. I mean, something obviously took over. He lost a grip of reality. This is when his psychotic behavior really started, and he developed this obsession with dead bodies. I think he thought that maybe if he wore this woman's suit that he could become his mother and bring her back. I mean, I don't know. Ed began stalking and studying obituaries to find women that had recently passed and recently been buried. And then right after these women were buried, at their final resting place, he would exhume their bodies. He exhumed bodies at 3 local graveyards around town. And this was something that the police were able to confirm actually did happen. They found a lot of empty caskets. Ed did admit that he was aroused by these dead bodies and the things that he did to them. It satisfied him, but he was adamant that he did not sleep with them because he said that they smelled too bad. So do you, buddy, apparently. He also denied ever being a cannibal, even though I don't know if I believe this because Bernice's heart was found right near his stove. Ed Gein confessed to only 2 murders, but his confession was actually thrown out because one of the sheriffs that was interrogating him, this man who was completely traumatized over what he just found at Ed's house, actually slammed Ed's head into a wall. It didn't matter anyways because Ed Gein was determined unfit to stand trial, and then he was later found not guilty by reason of insanity. A psychiatrist actually diagnosed him as being schizophrenic and also a sexual psychopath with an attachment to his mother. No duh. And he would spend the rest of his life in a psychiatric hospital where staff said he was a very polite man. Now, for all of those other unsolved disappearances I told you about in the area at the exact same time that Ed Gein was killing people and stealing bodies, he denied any involvement in any of those disappearances. And although there's no concrete proof that he was involved and he did pass 2 lie detectors, to this day there's a large group of people that do believe that Ed Gein was a serial killer and he was hunting unsuspecting residents and visitors that came to his town so he could steal their skin. 8-year-old Georgia Jean Weckler's kidnapper left behind Ford tire marks that matched the tires on Ed Gein's car at the time of her kidnapping. 15-year-old Evelyn Hartley was babysitting at a home that was reportedly only a few blocks away from a home that Ed Gein was at. He was apparently the exact same day that Evelyn disappeared. He was visiting a neighbor who only lived a few blocks away from the house where Evelyn disappeared at. And the two hunters, Victor and Ray, they vanished while hunting in the woods right near Gein's farm. Some unreliable sources say that one of these men's jackets was actually found on Ed Gein's property. But none of these people's remains were ever recovered, and to this day, all of their disappearances remain unsolved. Following the horrific discovery at his home, there was this huge, bizarre fascination with him. His car was actually bought by a carnival, and this was used as an attraction that people actually paid to go see. The plan was actually originally to auction off Ed Gein's family farm and all of his belongings, or to turn it into a tourist attraction that they would call the House of Horrors. But before either of these things could happen, the Ed Gein family home burned to the ground, and many suspect that this was arson. On July 26, 1984, Ed Gein died. He was in his 70s. He was buried at the Plainfield Cemetery, and in a twisted sense of irony, his own grave was tampered, vandalized, and stolen from. And his disturbing legacy would live on. Ed Gein actually went on to inspire some of the most terrifying, gruesome, disturbing, and iconic horror movie killers. Leatherface from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, who lived on his family farm that was filled with quite a few disturbing things. Leatherface killed his victims so he could wear their skin. Norman Bates from Psycho, a very disturbed man with an obsession with his mother, so much so that he actually tried to become his mother after she died. Buffalo Bill from The Silence of the Lambs, who kidnapped women, killed them, and skinned them so he could wear their skin as a women's suit. Each of these killers and movies were inspired by Ed Gein. And then those killers and those movies went on to inspire generations of horror movies after them. Friday the 13th, Halloween, 7, Wrong Turn, The Hills Have Eyes, House of a Thousand Corpses, The Strangers, You're Next, just to name a few. And then those movies went on to inspire the next generation of horror cinema, and so on and so forth. The horror genre, as we know it today, is almost entirely inspired by one disturbed man. Ed Gein's gruesome crimes left a permanent scar not only on a small town in Wisconsin, but on America and America's culture as a whole, inspiring some of the most iconic horror villains. While Hollywood took his depravity and turned it into blockbuster terror, it's easy to forget that behind this legend of Ed Gein were real victims, women whose lives were stolen in such violent ways, other women whose graves were desecrated, whose names are rarely remembered beyond the grotesque details of their deaths and what happened to them after they died. Today, Ed Gein's legacy is often reduced to this roadside curiosity, this freak show, or some horror trivia facts. But the truth is much darker than that. His crimes were not fiction, and the women that he mutilated were not characters in a horror movie. They were real people. They had names, they had families, they had hopes, and they had dreams, and they deserve to be remembered for a lot more than just footnotes in a monster's story. And that's all I have for this week's episode of Hot on the Case. Thank you so much for watching, listening to the end. It really does mean more to me than you will ever know. And I will see you guys all next week when we are hot on the case once again.